Thank you so much, Bo, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you at St. Luke's. As I said to Bo earlier, I enjoy being at St. Luke's because it's the sort of place where, if I'm staying in Manhattan, I tend to slip into the cheap seats, as I say, on a Sunday morning and enjoy uh, the strong modern Catholic liturgy, of which I appreciate, and you obviously do if you're a part of the place as well. So thank you for your own ministry and witness in the village and beyond. And thank you for having Andrew Ancona among you in recent times, who is one of our recent products. Of course, your rector is one of our less recent products, but it's great to have that connection with you as well. So I know you're doing a series on eschatology and Christian understandings of the end, various ends, and I guess my brief is to talk about the way the early church thinks about the end. The way the topic was framed, in fact, was of course the return of Christ, and here's where I have to seek forgiveness rather than permission that I'm interpreting the eschatological framework of the topic a little more broadly than just about the return of Jesus, but that's clearly one of the central themes in any conversation about what happens at the end. But just as I think last time, if I understand, you were discussing the revelation to John, the apocalypse of John. And of course, in that setting, you know that the return of Jesus is very much central to the whole thing, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on as well. So perhaps I can use that as a sort of model for wanting to think a little more broadly about the return of Christ, about the end of the world, about the eternal fate of human beings, about God's ultimate purpose for us and how we understand our fate, as well as the fate of the cosmos itself and how these things are bound up. So I'm going to share with you some ideas, some thoughts and quotes from a few early Christian thinkers. And because material evidence is even more fun than text, a couple of pictures that give us an idea of how early Christians might have conceived of some of these thoughts. And as you heard, I'm happy to be interrupted because I'm going to share my screen in a minute. The mysteries of Zoom don't always leave me clear as to whether I'll be able to see the chat. So you should just feel free to unmute and offer your learned question or your heartfelt objection in terms that I can hear, and then we'll pause and discuss it. But I will sort of come back into view personally after I've shared with you this presentation, and we'll talk together at the end of that as well. So whether we exchange along the way or exchange at the end, all is well either way. So I will try and do this exciting screen share thing now and see how that goes. Does that look okay? So the ancient church, of course, had to deal with one interesting kind of conundrum from pretty early times, and even the New Testament itself reflects this conundrum. It goes something like this: Jesus is coming really, really, really soon, so why isn't he here? And we see different writers of the New Testament already sort of taking slightly different approaches to this. And one way in which some scholars have tended to sort of think about this conundrum goes a little bit like this, that maybe Jesus himself, maybe the apostles or disciples, the immediate circle of Jesus, maybe his earliest followers, all expected something to be happening within a matter of weeks or months or days or at most years, but then it didn't happen, and then somehow everything changed. And a sort of shift took place within the early church from the Christian movement being a fundamentally apocalyptic movement, expecting the end of the world, ready to go up on the mountaintop, count down the days and wait until everything went up in smoke, and shifted then as that hope receded into the future to being something more like the rambling and sometimes lovable, often frustrating institutional reality, which the church is, which is sort of a very different thing. Now, I've just offered a caricature, which, like many caricatures, has a hint of substance in it, but we'd probably have to spend more time, and maybe that's what I'll do, really, unpicking the caricature rather than underlying it. I would rather suggest, in fact, that there are sort of two strands, to simplify it, two strands of eschatological thought which are already present in the Judaism of Jesus' time and which continue into the Christian movement at all the earliest stages and then continue into the early church. And these two strands are somewhat equivalent to the two elements of the caricature that I just offered. On the one hand, there is a strand of apocalyptic expectation about an imminent end and about God's determination to make a whole new world or to bring the world to a complete end. But on the other hand, there is also a strand that thinks about human life itself rather than human history, the individual human life as the stage on which eschatology is played out. Well, let me rephrase that. In one view, it's the world itself that's about to come to an end, and it's that end that has to be accounted for. In the other view, it's you and me that are coming to an end, and it's that end that has to be accounted for. And these are two views of eschatology, or two types of eschatology, which in fact do a kind of dance throughout Christian history. And it's true that in that dance, there are times when one partner plays the stronger part and the other one follows. And it may be true that in early Christianity, we find a certain emphasis given to the apocalyptic or millenarian understanding, as it's sometimes referred to, the idea of the world coming to a sort of dramatic point of transformation or of end. That theme is strong in the early church, but at the same time, it's also true that there is that theme of the question of what the end means to me. What if my end precedes the world's end? Then how am I supposed to think about my own end relative to the eternal purposes of God? The subtitle, which I've already distanced myself a little bit from apologetically, was The Return of Christ. And this image from a mausoleum in northern Italy, dating from the 6th century, perhaps gives us a sense of the tension between the two understandings of the kind of Jesus that we're hoping for. This, of course, is Jesus as the Good Shepherd. In some ways, it's like a depicted parable, the parable in Mosaic. But it's not only a picture of a parable, it's also a picture of heaven, we might say, but it's also a picture of the end of all things, the paradise in which God wills that life take place. And so being depicted here in this funerary context in a mausoleum, the Jesus who comes again is in one sense the great master and the great shepherd, but in another sense, the Jesus who comes again is the pastor figure who leads us all beside still waters. There's a hint of Psalm 23 in here, but perhaps also a hint of some of the imagery that we see in the book of the Revelation to John. So the Jesus who comes, the return of Jesus, is itself one of the elements that we hear incorporated in early Christian theology as both the apocalyptic millenarian understanding of the Christ who comes riding on the clouds, ready to end the whole of history and the cosmos. But on the other hand, the Jesus who comes is the Good Shepherd who guides us individually through the moments of our death, through the deep valley of the shadow of death, into the place of God's comfort and restoration for us in our moments of suffering. We'll think more about these themes as we go on. So, is it the case that the early church began with the kind of view that you could easily read into the Revelation to John, the view that everything is about to come to a remarkable, spectacular end, and then it changes? Or is it more that there are these two strands of thought which coexist with one another and that continue to wind their way through time? So, does apocalyptic expectation give way to concern for post-mortem existence? Let me just restate that again. If you think that, let's say that we're Christians who are living in the time of St. Paul, and Paul, like other early Christian leaders, says, well, the time is short, and so I don't want you to get too involved in human affairs because you never know if you might make, buy a treasury bond that's not actually going to mature until after the world has ended, and then that won't be a particularly good investment. So we get that kind of view. sort of popping up even in the authentic writings of Paul. But then we also have understandings, again, in Paul's own writings, about how we have to live our lives from the point of view of facing the reality of death, and how divine judgment and a fate that's dependent upon divine judgment may come to us after that. So is this a radical shift, or is it simply a readjustment of emphasis? Perhaps you're already hearing a hint from me that in fact it's the second of those options that's the way we should really understand the early Christian hope. Even though, of course, those images of the revelation to John and in other early Christian documents are quite vivid at an early point. Even at the earliest points, it's also true that there are themes and there are ideas in early Christian thought that have more to do with the fate of the individual and with the idea of post-mortem existence for individuals than are just about the whole cosmos wrapping up. And it isn't just that a sort of an apocalyptic worldview from the revelation to John, already exists in Judaism and then somehow gets tempered by its exposure to the wider world of Greek and Roman philosophy. It's actually the case that Judaism, even prior to Jesus, is already dealing with both of the strands that I've suggested. Even the Judaism of Jesus' time has both an understanding of God's apocalyptic end, of the cosmos, of human history, and of everything. But it also has understandings about human life as needing to be lived towards an eternal future, which has more to do with the individual. So I put this third question here in terms of a contrast between Jewish and Greek views, because it's sometimes a way in which perhaps theological works of the first half of the 20th century in particular tended to express a sort of contrast, as if Jewish and Greek views were fundamentally opposed about this. That it was basically that if the Jews had their way, it would all be about apocalyptic expectation. But then the Greeks had this understanding about the eternal fate of the soul, and that therefore this sort of debate between the two threads that I'm trying to describe is really as much a cultural conflict between Jewish expectations of God's final judgment and intervention in history versus Greek sort of expectations about the eternity of the soul and the way in which human existence goes on beyond the life of human material history. In fact, I would suggest that the two strands that I've tried to describe, the more apocalyptic and the more personal existential versions, both exist within both Jewish and Greek thought. That in fact, while it's true that Jewish schools of Jewish thought, such as the Pharisees, of whom we hear a great deal in the New Testament, put a lot of emphasis upon the notion of the end of history and of the fact of the resurrection, the general resurrection of the dead as part of God's envisaged intervention in history. That's true. But there were also Jews of the same period who were influenced by Greek thought, who thought more in terms of the life of the righteous being geared towards an eternal future with God, which followed death. And so the finality of human existence was more their concern than the finality of the world's fate. On the other hand, if we look at Greek philosophy, it's true that there are those like Plato who think about the soul itself as having a kind of independent existence of the body, that death would be the freeing of the immortal soul from the material corruptible body, and that should be seen as a good thing. And that kind of idea certainly influences Christianity, but it influenced Judaism as well. And it's also true that in Greek philosophy, there was an idea of the world itself having a kind of time of reckoning. There were Greek philosophers who thought that the world itself worked through cycles of destruction and renovation and renewal, that the world itself might only have 1,000 years to exist within the frame in which we knew it, and that the cosmos itself might end in a great conflagration and then have to begin again. This is actually a Greek idea and not just a Jewish one. So for us to sort of try and parse the different strands of thought that we see in the early church between the cultural traditions of Jewish and Greek philosophy and thought probably doesn't work. They're actually both complex. They both involve the two dimensions that I've suggested of the cosmic and historic end and of the individual, personal, existential end, the way in which my death and my life are the stage on which the great eschatological battle is played out, rather than it being the cosmos or history. Well, you'll have to forgive my spelling there. It's just, but it's bonus points for those who can mentally transpose the S and the P in that slide. But anyway, I want to show you a couple of quotes from second century authors, which might just sort of help us think, give us a bit of perspective about how early Christian thought goes forward after the time of a document like the Revelation to John. Again, if I may be so bold as to assume that's still fresh enough in your own minds. This is a quote from the Christian apologist, that is to say, defender of Christian faith, Athenagoras of Athens. And Athenagoras is trying to talk about the significance for Christian ethics of belief in the resurrection. And in particular, he is contending with the notion, which existed at this time, that Christians were themselves a barbaric and cannibalistic group, because somehow the notion that they gathered together in huddles to eat the body and blood of their Saviour was sort of had led to the notion that they were perhaps, in fact, taking part in cannibalistic feasts. This, by the way, is your second century equivalent of the QAnon conspiracy. So the Christians are assumed to be gathering in places where they're feasting upon the ill-gotten gains of pedophile rings and so forth. So there's nothing new under the sun, right? What these connections do actually tell us, by the way, is how accusations of that kind always tend to reflect forms of social anxiety about change that people can't control and that they can't understand. And mythologies like this pop up at a remarkable number of places in human history when sort of similar issues or characteristics come forth. The other example that's probably worth mentioning that many of you will be aware of is how Christians made similar accusations against Jews during the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period. The idea that Christian children were being stolen by Jews and were being murdered so that their blood could be used for matzah. That's sort of a story that is worth reminding ourselves of with penitence as every Passover comes around. So this is Athenagoras trying to rebut the cannibalistic accusations of his Greco-Roman neighbors. What person who is convinced of the resurrection would make himself into a tomb for bodies that will rise again? This is the idea of, why would I eat human flesh if I thought that the resurrection of the dead was a reality? But those who deny they will have to give account of the present life, be it wicked or good, and who reject the resurrection and who count on the souls perishing along with the body, and so to say, flickering out, are likely to stop at no outrage. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that Athenagoras actually shows a fairly neat synthesis of two different ideas, or what might have been in somebody else's thinking, two different ideas. On the one hand, there is the notion that there is a soul which has a separate kind of existence from the body. But notice that even though Athenagoras is giving quite considerable credence to this idea of the soul having a sort of an existence independently of the body, he believes that the resurrection, the literal material resurrection of the body is still part of the expectation of the Christian. So this is an early example that we find where the two different sort of ideas about sort of the eschatology of the last judgment, the notion that human history will be brought to an end and the resurrection of all the flesh would be a mark of that historical shift. So at the same time, Athenagoras has this idea that the individual soul will depart from the body and have some other kind of existence. He doesn't define or explain exactly how this works, but my point is really to suggest that he believes both things. In other words, we have in here the dance that I've described, the dance between eschatology as the final historical reality of the general resurrection and the individual experience of how death and judgment may come to us all. And he's concerned about promoting an appropriate view of Christian ethics as a result. Here's another late second century author, Irenaeus of Lyon. And Irenaeus is actually talking about the Eucharist as a kind of eschatological event for us. As the bread which is produced from the earth, when it receives the invocation of God, is no longer common bread, but the Eucharist, consisting of two realities, earthly and heavenly, so also our bodies, when they receive the Eucharist, are no longer corruptible, having the hope of the resurrection to eternity. Irenaeus is writing around the same time as Athenagoras, probably in the 170s. And Irenaeus also has this idea that even though we have the sacraments, something which are a fairly institutional, repeatable form of Christian ritual practice, that the point of the sacraments is actually not simply to prepare us for death or to help us to live a good life, or, I'm using caricatured language here. I hope we would come up with better ways of talking about it than that. But that Irenaeus is thinking very much still of the Eucharistic food as the food of the resurrection, as a kind of eschatological food, which we're taking in advance, that prepares us for the hope of the resurrection to eternity, as he calls it. But for him, as for Athenagoras, the fact of the materiality of the resurrection is still quite fundamental. So these two second century authors are for me both evidence of the fact that the ancient church is not giving up on the rather strange and potentially offensive notion, if you take it from at least a sort of a Greek philosophical point of view, the strange notion that the resurrection of the body is still quite fundamental to how Christians think about the hope of the church, even though at the same time they are incorporating into the way they talk about this hope of the final resurrection other uses of other ideas. In Irenaeus' case, it's the fact that we're a church that has the institutional reality that can have a sacramental life, but it's still about the resurrection. In Athenagoras' case, it's the fact that we may still think about the soul and its relationship to the body, and the soul is perhaps separating from the body of death, but it's still in anticipation of the resurrection. So there's a kind of interplay of two slightly different sorts of ideas here, but without any great sense of tension, I suggest, on their part. If you were to try and summarize the hope of the ancient church, there are certain things that I think we could affirm, and I think I've probably implied a couple of them already, that there will be an end. This is the universal Christian hope of the early church, that there will be an end, which is not simply an idea, not simply a metaphor, and not simply something that is about my own life, but rather that there will be a true historic cosmic end of the world as we know it and of human history as we know it. On the other hand, they also believe that the individual human life undergoes a sort of transition at death, which, depending on who we read, is either a kind of anticipation of that final end, which will come to the material world itself, or which somehow becomes a kind of a preliminary phase in that process of death and judgment, which has to yet be fulfilled at the very end. Those things are both true, and these are, again, my two dance partners, as it were, that the end as a material historic reality is affirmed, and our common individual ends, the end of our human life as something which takes us into a kind of transition into a different reality, is also the truth. But there are other things about which they don't necessarily seem to agree, and so that even though we're very familiar with Christians disagreeing, aren't we? Let us not think that this is simply the product of the modern era. Christians of the ancient church also disagreed about some quite interesting and important things to do with eschatology. So here are a few of them. They disagreed about how long all this was going to take. So while we saw that perhaps in the New Testament there may have been some people who thought that these events might take place within the lifetimes of those who were reading and writing the documents of the New Testament, of course, the longer you go forward in history, the clearer that is that was not going to be the case. But you still find considerable disagreement about how long it will be until that final end happens. And this is something which is still familiar to us, I guess, that while there may be some of us who've also transferred the idea of the end to being something which is more metaphorical or symbolic, there are, of course, many Christians who still spend time wondering when the literal end is going to be. I get an email every couple of weeks from someone who recalculates the end of the world every couple of weeks based upon what he's reading in the newspapers, and very helpfully sends it to me as an update so that I can pass it on to my divinity school students. You can imagine that it hasn't really sort of found its way into the center of the curriculum for me, but You're all familiar with that kind of stuff, of course, that, the sort of predictions of the end based upon the sort of rather apocalyptic events that it's not hard to find in the world around us. Perhaps that should help us be sympathetic to how those ancient Christians thought about the imminent end, because heaven knows there have been enough apocalyptic events around us in the last couple of years to sort of even will the end to be close, perhaps for some of us. But they disagreed about how long it would be. There were still some who thought, rather like those figures in the New Testament, that this was just around the corner and it might still be within their lifetimes. But there were others who started to develop more specific theories that actually put it hundreds or even thousands of years in the future. And this partly got sort of bound up with how some Christian writers began to think about interpreting certain passages of Scripture in the Revelation to John, of course, but also in the book of Daniel. If you've ever spent time in this sort of sphere or spent time in a fundamentalist or millennial sort of group, you'll understand that second only to the Revelation to John is the book of Daniel for this sort of predictive stuff. Not really very helpful in my humble opinion, but there were plenty of people who could come up with theories about how long the world would last based upon how they would read these texts. Second question, when the resurrection comes, because it's going to come, they assume, what will the body be like? And one obvious question is, well, is it going to be like this one? Because actually, personally, if I could put in an order, I might ask for some changes, perhaps, the one I used to have, or perhaps the one that I never really had, but would have liked it if I had the choice, that sort of stuff is not actually, I'm being flippant, but of course, it's not that hard to imagine why people might think that the idea of being restored to one's body is not necessarily the only thing that one could think of by way of an ideal future with God. And so the question of what that body would be like was sometimes controversial. I'm going to come back to one particular thinker who was an interesting contributor to that conversation. But maybe more generally, I could say there was sort of a bit of push and pull about whether the resurrection body is primarily something like the one we've got, maybe with some improvements, or whether the resurrection body was more like a spiritual thing. And spiritual opens up a whole other set of questions for us that we couldn't possibly deal with in the course of tonight. But you may know that sometimes when we read in the New Testament a contrast between matter and spirit, or flesh and spirit, it doesn't necessarily mean, just the base corporeal matter versus the completely ethereal and other. Sometimes what's of the spirit simply means something which is in greater accord with divine will. When St. Paul says, if we live according to the flesh, we do this. If we live according to the spirit, he doesn't mean that we stop being material beings when he says that, but rather the spirit is for him the principle which causes the Christian to live their life according to the will of God. So to talk about spiritual and material bodies could well be a way of talking at cross purposes in the ancient church, just as it can be a way of talking at cross purposes in the modern one as well. Third question, who can be saved? Well, this is important. It's important whether you're talking about the final historic end of the apocalypse, or whether you're talking about what happens to us when we die. And this, of course, is something which is of real pastoral significance to us, as well as necessarily of existential significance. And there's a tension there, and I'll touch upon this again in a minute, but there's a tension there between the notion that that God is simply winnowing the good and the bad out, or the faithful and the unfaithful, and that salvation will only come to an elect at the expense of a group of non-elect or condemned. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which also has significant adherence, is that God actually wills that all will be saved, and that experiences of suffering within human history, and perhaps experiences of suffering beyond human history, may all actually be intended to lead us towards some kind of different reality in which we're reconciled to God. We'll come back to that. Last but not least, but sort of related to the third, my fourth point, progress and purgation. We get emerging in the early Christian period this notion that, well, maybe if Uncle Joe was a member of the church, and he's shuffled off this mortal coil, but heavens, he had a lot of unfinished business, didn't he? Or how much of his baggage could he really take with him? Can you really imagine God welcoming Uncle Joe into the heavenly realms with some of the stuff that he'd done? And yet he was a well-intentioned sort, wasn't he? Well, the pastoral question of what do we think about Uncle Joe's fate becomes something which is played out in a more explicit way in Christian theology as we think about things like purgatory and the idea of an interim state beyond our knowledge in human material existence, in which people can continue to grow in faith, continue to make their way away from the bondage of sin, if it's been evident that the lives they lived did not allow for the completion of that kind of process. Because let's face it, not everybody who dies is a saint, but we might like to hope that there'll be people who will get into the kingdom who are not necessarily self-evidently saints. So I'm going to pursue a couple of these issues using some thoughts based on particular Christian thinkers. Another piece of material evidence here, just while we're thinking about it though, this is a panel from an early Christian sarcophagus, which depicts people at really what in some ways might be an unremarkable meal, dining at a sort of, with a bolster or bench in front of them and with a number of loaves. This kind of scene wouldn't be put on a sarcophagus if it was simply meant to be illustrating, dining choices for, Uber Eats 3rd century style. Rather, it's kind of an image of what the heavenly or the resurrected life would be like. People living in 3rd century Rome experienced a great deal of food insecurity. They had food deserts, as you may be aware of that phenomenon, even in contemporary American society. And the idea of paradise as a place where food was plentiful and secure was a much more potent image for them than it might be for us, who can take some of these things for granted, if indeed we can. Forgive me for presuming. So first example, relating back to the questions I just raised. One of the most intriguing voices from the early 3rd century of Christianity is the Christian woman Perpetua, who is martyred in Carthage in modern Tunisia just after the year 200. Perpetua seems to have left her own prison diary, which was incorporated into a longer work containing the story of her martyrdom by an editor of this period. But the passages I'm going to show you concern some of her own experiences from her own prison diary. She had a vision. In fact, Perpetua has a number of visions in this story, and one of them is a pair of visions about her brother, Dinocrates. And Perpetua tells us that she saw Dinocrates in a vision coming out from a gloomy place. He was parched and very thirsty with a filthy face. He had a wound. He'd actually died of cancer, we discover elsewhere in the work. And there's a pool full of water. It's brink higher than the stature of the boy. So he can't get to this pool of water. This is a little bit like, some of you may recall, the myth of Tantalus from Greek mythology, where, the person who's being tortured in the afterlife can't attain to what they need. Although the pool held water, on account of the height of its brink, he could not drink, and I was upset and knew that my brother was in suffering, but I trusted that my prayer would bring help to his suffering, and I prayed for him every day until we passed over into the prison of the camp, for we were to fight in the games. And then in the next chapter, she has another vision. This is after she's prayed, and she receives the vision. I saw that place which I'd formerly observed to be in gloom was now bright. Dinocrates, with a clean body, well clad, was finding refreshment. And where there had been a wound, I saw a scar, a healed scar. And the pool which I had before seen, I saw now with its margin lowered even to the boy's navel. And one drew water from the pool incessantly. Upon its brink was a goblet filled with water. Dinocrates drew near and began to drink from it, and the goblet did not fail. And when he was satisfied, he went away from the water to play joyously after the manner of children, and I awoke. Then I understood that he was translated from the place of punishment. This is the sort of longest full account we have of a kind of an image of basically that of the idea of purgatory, the idea that, I think that's what we should probably think of it as. Perhaps that's contestable. Some might argue that, in fact, what Dinocrates was being viewed as in was something more like hell, and perhaps to compromise between the two, perhaps more like the Greco-Roman notion of Hades as a place which was sort of inherently unpleasant, but not necessarily like the sort of medieval idea of the hell full of flames and fire and brimstone and so forth. But what's striking is that Perpetua is led to believe that her prayer actually frees her brother from this place of punishment, and he comes into this place of joy and refreshment. So this is an early way in which a Christian finds a way to connect their life of prayer with the pastoral concern of the needs of the dead. And this then goes on to have the rich and complex history of thinking of the souls in purgatory who are undergoing suffering, which has a point. Suffering which is not simply punitive, but suffering which is corrective. That not all of that is clear in Perpetua's story of Dinocrates, but what is clear is this notion that the prayer of the faithful could make a difference, and that's intriguing. Another image here. This is another 6th century mosaic, also from Ravenna, like the first one that I showed you. This is the apse of the Basilica of Santa Palinare in Classe, just outside Ravenna. And here we have the patron saint of the Basilica, Santa Palinarus, who is the first bishop of Ravenna, according to tradition. He's standing with his hands outstretched in a sort of a paradisiacal context, which is a little bit reminiscent of the one we saw in the mausoleum at the beginning, where again, sheep, to borrow from Bach's librettist, sheep may safely graze, and where trees are growing, which seem to echo the kind of image of the apocalypse of the Revelation to John, of the trees that are growing that have leaves for healing and fruit that fills the needs of those who inhabit the place. So this is a notion of paradise, and yet it also draws upon the apocalyptic imagery of the Revelation to John. Origen is perhaps the greatest theologian. Well, I'm going to quote from the two people who might spar for being the greatest theologian of the early church. One of them is certainly Origen of Alexandria, who dies in the middle of the 3rd century, around the 250s, apparently as a result of wounds or injuries received when he was tortured for his faith. He didn't literally die a martyr, but may as well have done. Origen became controversial after his death. This is something which should give us all pause for thought. If Perpetua gave us an example of someone who managed after death to be transferred from Hades to heaven, Origen gives us an example of the contrary, because Origen died in good standing in the faith of the church, but found himself in the 6th century, about 400 years after his death, being thrown out of heaven and the saints because of councils which condemned his teaching retrospectively. Why on earth would he do that? Well, here are 2 reasons. This is an extract from his work on prayer, where under the influence of Plato, and if you've read Plato's Timaeus, you might remember this notion, he suggests that perhaps the future shape of the resurrected body might not be quite like the one that we're familiar with. It's not in the least necessary, he says, to suppose that the bodies of the heavenly beings are so shaped as to have physical knees. Well, if your knees are acting up, this could be the text for you. Since those who have discussed them in a scholarly way have proved that their bodies are spherical. Anyone unwilling to accept this will have to accept the notion that each limb has its uses, since otherwise God would have created parts for them which have no function, unless he's prepared shamelessly to defy the canons of reason. Now, Plato's idea was that the shape of the soul, or of the purely spiritual being, ought to be spherical, because why? Well, the sphere is the perfect shape, isn't it? If you've done some sort of mathematics or philosophy, you probably won't want to argue with that, or maybe you will. Anyway, but Plato argued that the sphere is the sort of perfect shape because, of course, its diameter is uniform, and every part of it is the same distance from every other part. And Origen's basically saying that the heavenly beings, notice here that he doesn't actually say the resurrected humans, but he does say that the bodies of the heavenly beings are thus shaped. Now, if we just thought that meant the planets and the stars, that wouldn't actually be too difficult, would it? Because, well, actually they are spherical pretty much, more or less. But by talking about heavenly beings more generally, he seems to be thinking not only of planetary astronomical beings, so to speak, but also of other kinds of spiritual beings. And if you're a spiritual being, wouldn't you want a more perfect body rather than a less perfect body? And if you think that, and if you think this is such a silly idea, well, just just remember how your hip or your knee or, whatever it is that's a part of you that isn't feeling so great today. Just imagine that maybe being spherical could be preferential to that. This is one of Origen's controversial views. The other one, which I think is more interesting, is this one. There is a resurrection of the dead, he says, and there is punishment, but not everlasting. For when the body is punished, the soul is gradually purified, and so is restored to its ancient rank. For all wicked men and for demons too shall be restored to their former rank. Now, the former rank idea refers to his idea that all intelligent beings, all souls actually existed originally in a kind of harmony with God, and that some of them fell away from that unity with God through their own pride. Now, that idea may resonate with you if you've heard the idea of the myth of the fallen angels, because that's its sort of earliest form. The idea that different intellectual beings created by God all fell away from God before time and history into the sort of various forms in which they find themselves in history. Origen then imagines that after history, that each of these beings will be purged, but will experience forms of punishment or discipline, and that the point of that discipline will be their full restoration. And so Origen is really the great universalist theologian, the theologian who believes that the only reason that a good God would punish any being, including a human being after death, would be in order to discipline them, and that the point of discipline is, of course, not in itself punitive or self-sufficient, but rather it's in order to restore things to the way they were. So there are Origen's two controversial ideas. One more eschatological picture. This is Christ, the Christ who is the Pantocrator, as it's referred to by the art historians. The Pantocrator is the idea of Christ as the ruler of all. So this is an eschatological vision again. It's not untypical, as you would gather, for these apses of ancient churches to have this kind of image of what the end should be. This is what the worshipper looks towards in the Eucharistic ritual, is to see not simply some sort of interesting didactic moment or some sort of moral example staring down at them, but rather an image of what heaven should be like, an image of what the cosmos itself, renewed and restored and fulfilled, should be like. So here we have Christ and his angels rewarding, on the one hand, giving a crown to a martyr and the sort of a trophy in the shape of a church to a bishop who has been involved in its production. That's from the church, I think, of San Vitale in Ravenna. So last but not least, among these ancient thinkers whose ideas I want to just touch upon, Augustine of Hippo. He's the one who competes with Origen for being the greatest theologian of the early church. Augustine is writing sort of around the year 400 in Carthage, in Hippo in North Africa, which is not far from where Perpetua had been 200 years earlier. Hippo is in modern Algeria, though, just not very far from where Carthage was in modern Tunisia. And in fact, Augustine was active in both places. But Augustine, in his great work, The City of God, is perhaps the one who lands us in the end with what on a good day was the most sustainable view of Christian judgment and history, and which has certainly been influential, especially in the Western Church since then. Augustine is clear that we don't know when the end is going to happen, but he believes that there will be one. For we do not know how many days this judgment may occupy. And he doesn't just mean how long it's going to take, but even how long it's going to be until we get to it. For no one who reads the scriptures need be told that in them day is customarily used for time. Now, you've heard people who probably tried to translate days and years and, 1,000 years means a day and so forth. Augustine simply says day means time itself. And when we speak of the day of God's judgment, we add the word last or final for this reason, that even now God judges and has judged from the beginning of human history, banishing from paradise and excluding from the tree of life those first humans who perpetuated so great a sin. So judgment's always a part of God's activity, he says. Indeed, God was certainly exercising judgment also when he did not spare the angels who sinned, whose prince overcome by envy seduced men after being himself seduced. So that's another reference to that myth of the fall of the angels before all time. But Augustine is really saying that the characteristic of God as judge is not something that simply appears at a particular point in human history, but is actually true the whole time. And therefore, it's as much a mode of God's existence or being as it is something that only appears in history at a particular point. He does believe that there will be such a point, but for him, that's almost the secondary issue. The primary issue is the fact that when we talk about a judgment, we're saying something we know to be true about God's own being and activity at all points. Here's a bit of Augustine that relates back to that notion of purgation and the eternal punishment or the eternal joy of the deceased. Augustine says, temporary punishments are suffered by some in this life only, by others after death, by others both now and then, but all of them before that last and strictest judgment. So he's still talking about there being a last judgment. But of those who suffer temporary punishments after death, all are not doomed to those everlasting pains which are to follow that judgment. For to some, as we've already said, what is not remitted in this world is remitted in the next. That is, they're not punished with the eternal punishment of the world to come. Here he finds a bit of common cause with Origen, I think. The idea that even post-mortem punishment is not necessarily thereby an indication that after the last judgment, those same persons will not actually be with God and receive eternal blessing. So it's in Augustine that we find the most sophisticated synthesis of the ideas of what I referred to earlier on as the sort of the two dances. The dance of the existential reality of what it is that we experience at any time in our personal histories, and the idea of what will come at the very end. Augustine is sort of deliberately unclear about how he understands that final end to come, because for him, the judgment or the end is not simply something that will happen in time, but something that will end time. And because of that, because it will not simply be at the end point of time, but something through which time itself ceases to be, it's not possible to talk about it in terms that are not frankly mysterious. But it's from Augustine that we perhaps obtain the most influential sort of ideas that were common in the Western sort of classic articulations of eschatology, about both the human and individual existential notion of judgment being something that can happen at any point in our own histories, just as you said in the previous slide, but also that at the very end, which is not the end because it's past the end, time itself will cease to be. And that the Christian hope is therefore not simply that at a particular moment, Christ will come again in order to judge the quick and the dead, but that second coming will actually be an end of what we know as time itself, which of course raises the possibility of something more like a view that perhaps some of us have now, that the end, that the Christian hope of the end is not really dependent necessarily upon there being a particular point in time when it will come, because it's something that exists on the border between what is time and what is not time. For those of you who would like to read more, let me recommend one book. Brian Daly, a Jesuit scholar, now at Notre Dame, I believe, his book, The Hope of the Early Church, 30 years or so old by the look of it, is still a very reliable and thoughtful guide to these questions in the ancient church. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if you'd like to talk about any of this stuff.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your questions.
My question was Athenagoras of Athens writing in Greek?
Yes, Athenagoras is writing in Greek. And in fact, most of the Christian writers of the first 3 centuries, even in the Western world, are writing in Greek. Interestingly enough, the first Roman Christian authors we have all write in Greek through the 3rd century, because Greek was still if you'll forgive me sort of mixing the metaphors, Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman world among the lower and middle classes. Interestingly, the first Latin literature we have in Christian circles doesn't come from Rome at all, but from those African authors, from Perpetua, her contemporary Tertullian, and then from Cyprian and then of course later from Augustine. By the time we get to Augustine, around the year 400, the Roman Christians are writing in Latin too.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other questions?
Would you have any comments on the thinking of Gregory of Nazianzus on any of these points?
Both the so-called Cappadocian theologians, Gregory and his friend Gregory of Nyssa, are two people who sort of stand in some respects in the tradition of Origen, but who tend to sort of moderate the parts of Origen that start to look as if they're getting him into trouble. So I think that Gregory Nazianzen and Gregory of Nyssa both seem to have a measure of sympathy for Origen's notion of a universal recapitulation or a universal reformation of the world, including God's potential to redeem the whole of humankind, but they're much more guarded about letting that be seen as a kind of a standard view. I think that they are perhaps guarded because they're concerned about the pastoral implications of, and in fact, this is true of Origen too. They're all guarded about the pastoral implications of thinking about universalism. You see where this goes, probably, can't you? That if you just affirm that everyone's going to be saved anyway, well, what does it matter? Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die and God will look after us all anyway. I think if we'd asked Gregory or Origen about this, they would have said, well, yeah, God will save you in the end, but you sure as heck wouldn't want to be there in the meantime. The purgative suffering of what it would take to reform the person who is, an abject sinner into the image of the divine into which they were made would be something unattractive. But I cannot think of anything more specific about Gregory Nazianzen with regard to the end of the cosmos. I think his views are otherwise fairly conventional, that there will be one. Did you have anything in particular in mind, or something you'd like to share yourself from your own reading?
Well, I can't really speak about it very well, but it just does seem that compared to the West, many of the Eastern prayers in the liturgies of the church, both Greek and Syriac, which I certainly don't know anything about, but have heard some scholars speak about, or the Armenians, there's almost more of a yearning for the return of the innocence of the Garden of Eden, rather than participating in some sort of medieval original sin.
Yes, and this is also true, for instance, in Irenaeus, whom I quoted you that Eucharistic section about early on, although Irenaeus is very early, before Origen. Irenaeus is really the originator of an idea that I didn't sort of talk about directly, that connects with this idea, though, of Origen's, of the universal restoration. Irenaeus thinks that the way God saves the world is basically by rerunning history. That he takes up Paul's notion of Christ as a new Adam and sees Christ as succeeding where Adam failed. So he would view, the temptation story of Christ in the wilderness that, we began Lent with, as a kind of recapitulation of the garden story. And then imagines that Christ will carry through the burden of Adam in a way that reforms the whole of humanity and ultimately of human history, so that the point would actually be to run the film backwards and take us back to the garden, in a sense. And I think that those mosaic images that I showed you from Ravenna actually pick up some of that same sort of spirit at the level of piety and visual piety, that what the worshipper hopes for in that sense is not the sort of later Western image of heaven as this place crowded full of popes and friars and so forth, but rather as this place which looks more like the idyllic natural order that clearly evokes the image of paradise. And I think that we would probably expect to find that sort of notion in Gregory of Nazianzus as well as in Gregory of Nyssa, because of their debts to Origen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, if I can ask it.
Please.
Yes. Okay. I remember reading that the concept of resurrection actually came from the pagans who they knew that the earth got cold in the winter, and to them the gods died, and then in the springtime when things started growing again, they explained it by the gods came back to life. And also that when they came back to life, the body of the gods was in the grain and the bread, and the blood of the gods was in the grapes, which became the wine. And then the Romans, who were pagans, applied that to Christianity, to Jesus, when they were adopting Christianity. Have you come across that?
There are a few different ideas in there, which are all interesting, but I think I'd probably want to sort them out a little more and assess them on their merits. I think that we find in Mesopotamian religion, so the religion of the area sort of to the east of ancient Israel, there are ideas involving the cyclical life of seasons and agriculture, in which the idea of the sort of the death and rebirth of the gods is a part of that image. It's not as prominent really in Greek and Roman religion. There's a hint of it, like the myth of Proserpine, Persephone in Greek mythology, who spends half the year in the underworld with her husband and then half the year above the ground, but she doesn't actually get reborn. I think that the way in which an idea of resurrection occurs in Judaism, which is of course where Christianity gets it, is so different from that it's hard to sort of, I'm unconvinced usually by efforts to sort of reduce everything, well, this all came from this one particular place. I think that in fact we see a whole range of different ideas playing through human history, including through the history of Judaism and Christianity. But I think that sure, there were people before the Jews who had thought of an idea of resurrection, but not in the sense that the Jews did, of it being the apocalyptic eschatological resurrection. The idea that that human history itself would reach this kind of denouement, and I think that the motive for the Jewish idea of resurrection, which Christianity sort of takes over, is quite different from the notion that it reflects something about the eternal cycles of the seasons and of agriculture. It's actually more like a response to the crisis of the justice of God. That how can there be a world in which God is just and true, and yet in which we find that the righteous die unavenged, or in which the poor die unavenged? And if we're looking for the genesis of the Jewish notion of resurrection, I think it lies more in the social and historical realm than it does in the agricultural cycles, even if the idea of perhaps life being renewed might be there somewhere in the background. But the Jewish idea of resurrection enters more into this notion of the need for history itself to be redeemed from injustice, and for God, in effect, to be redeemed from the notion of injustice by showing that God has a purpose whose character and whose plan could not simply be inferred by what we observe in the world around us, but rather must be affirmed in something which we believe lies beyond what we observe. And that, of course, could be taken either into the realm of the individual's life and how reward or punishment might nevertheless await someone who hasn't experienced their just deserts during life, or it might be played out in the historical realm of saying that in the end, he will cast down the mighty from their thrones and lift up the lowly. And that's a rather different image, I think, from saying, well, it may be cold now and we may be depressed and lonely now, but spring will come again and therefore everything's nice. So that's sort of, there's a sort of superficial would be the wrong way of putting it. There is a hint of similarity in the notion of reversal, but the idea that gets incorporated into Judaism and Christianity is not that of seasonal cycles so much as it is of historical reversals. And I think that it's true, of course, that we find, hints and images and connections in a whole variety of religious traditions in the ancient world. What I would be resistant to is the notion, that any particular notion in Judaism or any particular theme in Christianity all goes back to that other pagan thing, which, we get this every Easter when people start talking about, well, the real reason we have Easter is because of paganism and so forth, but which is nonsense, I'm afraid. But, of course, human traditions and cultures are complex and they all borrow from one another. So we shouldn't be scandalized to see that there are similarities as well as differences. And the question is really what a particular text or what a particular thinker or what a particular tradition makes of the ingredients that they've been given as they bake their particular cake.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the theme of reversal, are there any writers or texts that reflect upon Thomas, the resurrection's appearance to Thomas and the 11, where Jesus carries into his eschatological new creation the wounds that he received and that we all necessarily receive in this age. Is the resurrection a kind of explosion of the meaning of suffering, taking up of the wounds of the old creation, in some way transforming them, and indeed even celebrating them in the new?
This is a very interesting question. Thank you for that. I haven't got a particular thinker for you just at the top of my head, and I apologize for that. Maybe it's something I could dig around for you to think about. But there is a connection, I think, between the point you've made and the story that I shared with you from Perpetua's diary.
Yeah.
Because as you may have noticed, you may be picking up on this, that when Dinocrates, her brother, is healed from his situation of suffering, his purgative suffering, if we can see it as that in retrospect, and taken into the place of plenty and fulfillment, he has a scar where his own wound had been. And in fact, a colleague of mine I heard a couple of years ago give an interesting paper about the Thomas scene, and this is really more about what John's Gospel says rather than about what the later versions do. But it is a striking reality, as you've implied very clearly, John, about how the risen Christ appears with the wounds. Whereas you could imagine that if a more Platonizing author had written that gospel, they might have got rid of the wounds because, why wouldn't Jesus have come back with a perfected body? But in fact, even the Gospel of John doesn't necessarily imply that the wounds haven't been healed, but that they haven't been eradicated either, as it were. And I tend to think that maybe that there's a hint of the same sort of viewpoint in Perpetua's description of her brother Dinocrates, that maybe therefore that the Christ who appears to Thomas and says, "Put your hand in my side," and look at the holes in the nails, doesn't mean that he's raw and bleeding, but rather that his body reflects the whole of his genuine experience, and yet even that experience is not erased but transformed. And so Perpetua is my best imperfect offer to you, but I think you'd already picked up on that connection by the sound of it. And I think it's a very interesting issue.
Yeah, I'm thinking of David Carr's book, David Carr at Union Theological, the Old Testament professor there, that I'm reading for Lent, Holy Resilience, the Bible's Traumatic Origins. And not merely, of course, the origins of Israel's memories with the constant ruination of Israel and Judah almost by Assyria, Babylonia, especially, but also certainly in the New Testament, the reason why we have the Bible is because it's a fruit of trauma.
Right. Yeah,
and the reason why we have the risen Christ is because he's the fruit of trauma.
Yes. I think that's a wise and thoughtful comment, and thank you for raising that book, of which I'm only aware of by name. I think this is something I sometimes try to be at pains to communicate to students and others, that who are sometimes very taken aback by the amounts of violence and trauma that are depicted in Scripture. But in fact, it's because Scripture is the product of a world like the one we inhabit, even if it's different in some respects. If you only have to look at the news to wonder whether a Bible free of trauma would be of help to people in Myanmar this week, or whether it would be of help to people in Atlanta last week, because in fact, the reason we have a cross is because the world is full of crosses, not because we would not wish it to be otherwise, but because we keep erecting crosses. And the question really is whether our Christian story is an effective answer to the problem of where God is in a world full of crosses, rather than whether or not we could imagine that if we all just did better, that somehow the cross would be unnecessary.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. There's one question that popped up in the chat, and then I think in the interest of time, we'll close with that, if that's all right with everyone. Victoria asks about, you talked about, D. McGowan, about temporary punishment that takes place both in this life and after our physical lives. She wants to know, what type of temporary punishment are you referring to, and why does that happen in different stages in life?
Yeah, I take it this is a reference to the Augustine passage especially, although it could also refer to some things that Origen says. I think this does actually connect a little bit with the conversation I was just having with John, because I think that what Augustine is trying to do is to make sense of the known fact that people experience suffering. It's not that he starts with the abstraction of God and then saying, well, God doesn't like certain things you do and therefore God's going to punish you. I think that rather he starts with the pastoral observation of the fact that human beings suffer and is trying to make sense of it. So the answer is not, the question is not, well, why would God cause suffering, so much as why do people suffer at all, and what sense can we make of it? Which is there's a subtly different question there. And I think that Augustine shares at least part of Origen's rationale here for thinking that the character of human experience is often mysterious, especially when we can't make sense of the ways in which we suffer and struggle. And yet both of them, I think, believe that in order to affirm our faith in a God whose ultimate purpose is good, we actually have to acknowledge the possibility that God has a purpose in allowing certain forms of suffering. Now, I struggle with that. If you do, I don't know, but I struggle with that myself. But again, it's a little bit like the conversation with John. The fact is, it's a world with crosses, and the question is really whether we can actually use our Christian story to interpret these forms of suffering, or whether we must, regard them as meaningless, and therefore. It doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't oppose suffering, that we shouldn't work to eliminate suffering, but it doesn't matter how much you or I work to eliminate suffering, it will still be experienced in certain respects, I'm afraid. And I don't think we should create false dichotomies like that. So I think Augustine is referring both to punishment that takes place during this life and punishment that takes place after life. And I think that, like Origen, he believes that we should not allow experiences of suffering to cause us despair, because we may believe that God's purpose is disciplinary or purgative. I don't know whether those ideas are to our taste, but nevertheless, shall we say that in the ultimate vision of God, all of our human experiences of alienation and suffering and struggle can be redeemed through the purposes of a God who can turn our wounds into scars, who can provide healing for what we experience in life without erasing it, without pretending that it's not a part of who we are and what we've experienced. Why and how the world is that way is still maybe something with which we struggle, but they're trying to help us make sense of it and to understand that it could have some kind of place in God's good purpose.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to wrap us up here, as I said, in the interest of time. D. McGowan, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a really fascinating talk, and I enjoyed it immensely, and I'm sure others did. We look forward to having you back with us in the future at Adult Ed at St. Luke's. And in the meantime, we wish you and everyone at YDS a blessed Holy Week and Easter when that comes. My thanks to everyone as well this evening for your questions and participation, and for engaging with Dean McGowan's talk. And we look forward to seeing you all next week at the same time, 7 p.m. For the next installment in this series. Thank you.
all.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank
Father.
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, St. Luke's. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
A lot.